Welcome to hashtag 52 Needs, and this week we are talking about fairness at work specifically. And I'm so delighted to have with me Jeanette Jifkins, who is the principal lawyer of Brisbane North Lakes-based Onyx Legal, a boutique corporate and commercial business law firm. Jeanette is also the author of bestseller Your Arse Online, a guide to protecting your online business assets. I'll never be able to read this without laughing. And sought after presenter and educator for national conferences on topics concerning the legal risks of business online. Jeanette loves what she does and is passionate about identifying the practical legal solutions that fit the individual business and writing simple contracts that make sense in each business and to its customers. Outside work, Jeanette loves to spend time on their farm with her husband, enjoys swimming, and teaches jiu-jitsu. Hello, Jeanette, welcome.
Hi, Angela. Thank you.
Okay, we've talked about fairness at work, in life.
In life, yeah.
And we've already identified that fairness and justice are not exchangeable and they're something completely different. So if you want to know more about that, please go to the other podcast about that. But I would love to talk to you about, do we have fairness at work? Because there's work fairness, there are all these people who are in charge of fairness at work. There are actual organizations called Fairness at Work, as far as I know.
Yeah. So the way employment is structured in Australia is we have a Federal Fair Work Act, and that has been built over time.
Mm-hmm.
And that sets out a set of principles. So, for example, there's the National Employment Standards, and that's 10 standards, which are the minimum standards that an employee should be able to expect in a workplace. It doesn't necessarily mean they are applied, but legally they are required to be applied.
Yeah.
So what that generates is if an employee feels their employer is not meeting those national employment standards, that they can make a complaint, and there's a body they can make a complaint to. But I mean, as part of that whole system of law, there are a number of processes that are available to employees now, like a claim for unfair dismissal or a claim for unfair treatment in the workplace, say through discrimination or something like that. And there is an avenue for them to be heard. So there's that concept of it being fair work. And then if you speak to a number of employers, they'll say a lot of the restrictions that are generated by fair work create situations that are not fair from their perspective. So again, it comes down to perspective and where people are coming from and what their experience is, and how that influences, what they think and what they say. Yeah.
Okay. So when we talk about fairness at work and all these criteria that have to be met, but there are some that are really obvious, and they play into, again, with our unconscious biases. But for example, just the fact that we are women, right? And I know that I do a lot of work with women, and we talk about fairness quite a bit. That, fairness, being paid at work, equal wages, or having the same opportunities to climb the ladder.
Yes.
Because there's always this, well, you're having the baby, right? And I hear this a lot, that there are questions being asked of women that men would never have to answer.
Yes. I can remember in a work environment, I was told that you've gone further than any other woman in this organization. You should be proud of yourself. After I resigned.
Lovely.
And they were intending that to be a compliment.
Yeah, I'm sure. Unconscious, yes. Yeah. No, I have had situations like that as well, where I was being complimented on things, and I would say, have you actually asked my male colleagues the same question, and I made the same compliment? And they went, no, why? And I'm like, yeah, that's my point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really difficult sometimes to identify whether somebody actually means it, because when I called out the person on that, they were mortified. They were like, oh God, no, I didn't mean it like that. So there are these ideas of what we think is equal and fair, and we're treating everybody exactly the same way, doesn't really happen. So the longer we talk, the more I'm beginning to doubt if we actually have fairness.
Well, fairness is perception. So it's like the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
If someone thinks the situation is fair, then it's fair. And if you can get all of the people in the situation to think the situation's fair, then it probably is, because everyone has a consensus and agrees. But one of the things about the workplace, whether something's fair or not, we were talking about unconscious biases before, and one of the things I became aware of is there's an actor who I'm not a fan of, and it's no fault of the actors, but I just don't like that actor, and as a consequence I just don't want to watch any of their movies that they're in. But the way this really played out for me and made it very obvious for me was I went to a business presentation one day, and the speaker looked like that actor, just, and I did not hear anything that speaker said, because I was so distracted by the fact that this person looked like that actor and I didn't like that actor. I couldn't hear past that preconceived position. And that, when I read into that, there are really little things that can trigger it, like the shape of the eyebrows, or the color of the eyes, or just an expression someone uses. There can be little things that people do that trigger a response in you related to something in your past. And if that response is triggered, then you're going to be treated differently according to that past event, and not treated as anybody else might be. And the same happens when, people get on really well.
Exactly.
It can be the same thing, oh, you look like my dad and therefore I think you're fabulous, or you look like my nana and therefore you're wonderful. The baggage that we come to the world with has such a big influence on the way we react to people. And in a work environment, you've got all of that. So if a supervisor of your area or whatever has one of those preconceived expectations in their background, and they look at you and you fit either the category of, oh, you must be wonderful, or I cannot trust you, or you must be lazy, or any of these sorts of things, it doesn't actually matter what you do, because they have that preconceived idea, and unless they challenge that themselves and change their mind, you're stuck with it. And this creates situations in the workplace that clearly aren't fair. I mean, I've seen situations in the workplace where one person might be spoken to differently than everybody else, and it's so inappropriate. And it may be that kind of workplace where nobody else wants to speak up because they don't want to be, the subject of that kind of communication as well. And it just, those situations, how can that possibly be seen as fair? Because there is no equality, there's no commonality, there's limited compassion, there's a sense of fear, there's all these restrictions on behavior in the workplace.
Okay. So again, I love this, because I this whole thing of, I always say we work with people we know. And when we feel really comfortable, it's because we resonate with them on a positive vibe. Like you said, it reminds me of Nana. When we don't, then we don't. But I realized at one point that I had worked for my father 3 times. I had exactly the same issues with these people that I had with my father. And it was a big aha moment, because I literally would come home at night and go, it's not fair. I'm doing all of this work and I'm not getting, and it's never good enough, and I'm not getting any acknowledgement. And then I had this moment again, same as you, lots of personal development. And I had this blinding flash of the obvious, where I went, I got to stop working with my dad. It's none of his fault. It's none of these other people. It's mine. But it was this whole perception of it's not being fair. I'm doing what I can and nothing is ever good enough. And funnily enough, as soon as I changed that for me, it also changed the way I worked with people.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about proving myself all the time and wanting to have approval or anything like that. I was able to contribute in a whole different way.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't fishing for that anymore. And the other thing, of course, is people didn't trigger me anymore. When they wanted that approval, I would just go, nah.
Yes, it does make a world of difference. I think that self-awareness, one of the conversations we have in this workplace, we have team meetings every Monday morning, and some aspect of that team meeting is often learning and supportive in terms of one member of the team may be going through something, and we've created an environment where people feel safe in sharing what they're going through.
Yeah.
And as a result, you've got a support team. You know, you've got a group of people here who are prepared to say, well, take a deep breath, give yourself a break, either take some time out and do this, or just sit back and listen and go, oh no, that doesn't sound fair at all. Or, is there anything you need? Is there anything we can do to support you in this situation? It's create an environment where people feel heard and able to get that sort of stuff off their chest.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it exists in some workplaces and not in others.
I know I have worked in places like that where everything was either, pushed down and nobody talked about it until somebody exploded. And when, like, again, it wasn't just about not being fair anymore. It was just outrageous. And then in places where, there was a vulnerability to talk about it. And then again, this whole thing of it's not fair disappeared, because if somebody moped around and, was a little bit, short or harsh with somebody, and we would have these moments of where we would just sit around and share, I'm just really in a grumpy mood because I've just had a fight with my partner and I can't shake it. And it would immediately lose that, that's, it would immediately become,
it has no sting.
It just takes it all out.
Yeah.
And again, if somebody would mope around for the next 10 days and, not change out of that, somebody would gently take them aside and say, would you like some help? And not snap out of it, but would you like some help?
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating here, but it's
no, I know what you mean. Yeah.
That kind of being there. And again, fairness in that regard is not, I've been giving you support, now it's my turn. Sometimes people support in all sorts of different ways. And, somebody likes to talk about things. And I always love the 5 love languages.
Yes.
That's the same thing. I can support somebody simply by being with them and spending time with them. I don't need to talk, but I can have somebody I want to talk with, or, I can do something for them. That's an act of service, and they will appreciate that and they will feel supported. And again, fairness then doesn't come out, I've done this for you, now it's your turn, but it's just, we're in this together.
Yeah, absolutely. There was something I was going to say about that too. Oh, that's the thing. In our workforces now, we have the advantage of a mental health first aid training. So we've had first aid officers in the workplace for many, many years for physical accidents. But there's now the ability to train people in the workplace in mental health first aid. And I did the training in that. I need to update actually, but I did the training in that. And it just really opens your eyes to the fact that there are people going through stuff and there are people not coping. And, something like 45% of our workforce is going to have some form of mental health unwellness in the course of their work life. So how do we best support them? Well, in any workplace, if you can get someone with the mental health first aid training, not just first aid training, then you expand your opportunity to be able to support people appropriately. And we advise employers. We've had an employer recently who said, oh, this person said such and such at the workplace, and I told them to go home and think about it. Now, the person they made that comment to suffers anxiety and depression. So you can imagine the impact that kind of comment. The employer didn't think there was anything wrong with that comment. It was just a comment from the supervisor. It's not a big deal, blah, blah, blah. But to a person with that, in that situation, who suffers anxiety and depression, you've just made their condition 10 times worse.
Yeah.
And they are going to be belaboring that one comment for the entire weekend before they come back to work on the Monday. And they're probably going to be in a worse state when they come back to work on a Monday than they left on the Friday afternoon. So having someone with the appropriate training in the workplace can mean that that comment, instead of being made, a much more appropriate comment can be made, and you can retain your workforce, you know, and you're not having to retrain people, and you're not sacking people left, right and centre, because there's a better understanding of the impact of the way in which you say things on different people in the workforce, and in a better awareness of, well, this kind of behaviour is representative of potentially that situation or that condition, and therefore I need to be careful how I respond and more considered in my response.
And what it does, it takes immediately the sting out of, you know, like when somebody makes that kind of comment, and then when being called on that and saying, you know, that maybe could have been, you know, next time do this in a different way because this person has some mental health issues, the person would have said, but I was just being fair to all the other people who were impacted on that. And when somebody knows about that, that just disappears, and begin again, kindness and compassion. I think on one hand, we've forgotten how to be kind and compassionate, but on the other hand, we never have forgotten that, because as soon as somebody points out to us what it means to be kind and compassionate, we remember. We can immediately, I mean, if we are then mature enough, then we can immediately justify that by doing something very simple, by saying, I'm sorry.
Exactly. Yep. And as soon as I do know someone who says, why should I say sorry? It's not my fault. So, well, it's actually not about you. And it's got nothing to do with fault.
And what you think is fair is also what this is not about.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, there are people prepared to hear those comments, and there are people who are not.
But the thing that I know that I've it's very clear that when people feel that they're being treated fairly, and again, that could be according to their limitations, according to their skills, money wise, you know, like income wise, and probably the other 10 aspects that you've mentioned, you know, with regards to managing boundaries, you know, working on the weekend, who knows, there are all these different aspects that we could now open up and talk for the next 2 hours. But one thing that's absolutely sure is when people feel they're being treated fairly and there's fairness in the workplace, their productivity skyrockets. But when they feel that they're being untreated unfairly, there's absenteeism, there's illness, there are all sorts of ways in which people deal with it unconsciously, because they may not even want to acknowledge that they're being treated unfairly, or that there's unfairness overall, or, you know, their perception in any case. And then they don't talk about it. And again, if we don't talk about it, nothing changes.
That's right. That is right. Yeah.
And then the resentment grows.
Oh, it does. And then, like you were saying before, people explode. Resentment builds and builds and builds and builds. But if you create an outlet where people can feel heard and can express themselves, and I think, you know, this ability to express dissatisfaction. So I've had experience with the whistleblowers legislation, which came into effect and had a big impact at the beginning of 2021, I think it came in, or 2020. And so it's impacting a lot of organisations now, where people, if they don't feel heard within their organisation, the whistleblower legislation allows for people to remain anonymous, makes it a responsibility of the workplace to ensure that anonymity and protect it. And then if the whistleblower is not content with the way in which the workplace has handled the complaint, they can then go to other bodies like the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, or WorkCover, or other places like that. With that, I think that is now opening it up for work environments where people have not felt heard, or where it is the people who have the most power and control over them in the workplace are the ones they're afraid to talk about. They've now got an avenue. And I know colleagues who have whole businesses built around responding to whistleblower complaints. And I also know colleagues who are board members who then have to deal with those complaints and the different sides of it. And the challenge in getting a complaint like that is to remain open-minded. It's to stop thinking, okay, who made the complaint, and set that aside, because that judgment we were talking about before, just because someone looks or seems like someone you like or someone you don't like gives you a preconceived way of treating them. If you don't know who the complaint's from, you don't know whether they're male, female, a current employee or a former employee or any of those things, that complaint sits there. Then you have to take the complaint at face value and say, okay, now we actually have to investigate this from a real perspective in our organisation, and we have to deal with it. And it's you can imagine how difficult it must be to let go of who made the complaint, because the concept of the person who made the complaint is going to influence our consideration of this complaint. It's very hard to let go of that. But it's not about that. It's about, okay, we've got to a situation where we have a complaint in our workplace, and if it's escalated to this level, how serious must it be, and how do we investigate it and deal with it? And you've got to change your focus. And I think that's challenging for a lot of businesses, and it is creating, it's a niche area of work for the legal profession. And I just can't imagine how harrowing it must be for people on both sides of the equation. So if someone is in such a desperate situation that that's the only avenue they feel they can make a complaint, and then the people who, maybe at a board level have no day-to-day control over the organisation and look at this and go, oh my God, we thought everything was going well. How do we deal with this? There's going to be a lot of angst and a lot of concern that if there was a workplace where you said before there's a level of vulnerability where people can feel heard, it doesn't escalate to that situation.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking, I mean, we do remove some of these things now to make it easier for people to, this has nothing to do with work, but the voice, right? The TV series where people sit with their backs and listening to people sing. And I mean, I don't watch a lot. I mean, I can't remember the last time I've watched it, but I get snippets every now and then on Facebook or somewhere, this is really amazing. And people turn around and go, wow. And if it had been fair, and if everybody had been seen, again, all these unconscious biases would have kicked in. And again, we know this. I mean, there's a place where all of these biases are exposed on a daily basis. It's in the US, a country that calls itself the melting pot. And it's more, there's more bias than in many other countries. But again, so it's the ability to recognize that we've got those biases. It's the ability to recognize that we have to remove them. Another thing that I was just thinking of is when people send in a resume and it's not clear from the name what the gender is, and it looks like a man's resume, it gets treated very differently than when it's a woman's resume. So even the accomplishments get treated differently. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, again, the whole thing, it's fair, like women are equally, if not more educated than men, and often have to work twice as hard. And I'm not getting on a feminist soapbox here, but the truth is that fairness is very relative when you're a woman.
Absolutely. And they have done, apparently there's a lot of research out there. I used to work with the Australian Psychological Society, and there were quite a lot of publications on different types of research where they showed, particularly with resumes, not just the male-female dichotomy, but the cultural background. So if you take a name off a resume and you just present the information without any suggestion of any background, then those resumes are treated more fairly. And the one, I think one of the ones that came out of Harvard showed the percentage. There was a really interesting piece of research I read where it showed the percentage of people from certain backgrounds who made it to shortlists based on their cultural background
Yeah.
So Spanish, if the name was Spanish, it was sort of put right at the bottom of the list. If a name was Asian, it was lower. Jewish names, all these sorts of things. If the names were seen, they sat in a demographic, and it showed you where they sat, and it was just astounding, the level of impact just someone's name. And you can imagine people marry into these names as well. People change their names by default. It doesn't necessarily reflect their cultural background. And even if it does, why should people be disadvantaged because of their cultural background? So yes.
Well, we can talk about that for hours, because I
Yes.
actually studied cross-cultural history.
Okay.
So this, and especially racial discrimination. So
yes.
And this hasn't changed. I mean, like in 2-3
in any country.
country.
People talk about different countries being racist and that kind of thing. Every country in the world is racist to people not from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. Now, we can talk about this much more, and I hope we will, but let's just leave it at this for now. This was supposed to be these, as all of these are, they're supposed to stimulate the thinking of everybody who's listening and watching, and consider, what does fairness mean in your life? How does it show up in your work? What can you do? Where do you keep silent? Where are you fulfilling your need for fairness? Where you're not? When you watch the one on fairness in life, how does it play out in your relationship? There are all sorts of questions. So I would invite you to have a think about it. And thank you so much, Jeanette. This has been a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.